Paul Hirsch, longtime De Palma editor, started with him very early, almost from the beginning. He learned editing by cutting his teeth on De Palma films. Also, famously, he's worked with John Hughes on Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and most famously, with George Lucas on Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back. Talk about a legend in the editing business. And, of course, his relationship with Lucas blossomed because he had a relationship with De Palma. His career really grew because of De Palma. Raising Cain, he edited, along with many other great De Palma films, Carrie, Sisters, a lot of them that we've been discussing in this series, Blowout. Here he is talking about the art of editing, talking about his time and impressions of De Palma, the working relationship he had with him, and then we discuss a little bit about John Hughes at the end of it. Here's Paul Hirsch. The editors tend to be very meticulous, intellectual, very focused. What was it about your sensibilities that drew you to film editing, do you think?
I studied art history at Columbia College, and I went to take a degree in architecture subsequently. But it was another bachelor's program, and I wasn't really prepared for another 4 years just to get another bachelor's degree. So around that time, there were a number of things that, I don't think there was a single thing, but my interest in architecture was something that turned out to be remarkably similar to editing in a way. And then I had been to, in getting my degree at Columbia, I had been to a summer program in Paris. And Paris, as you know, is, the cinephiles' capital.
Right.
And there were little art houses all over the city, especially in the left bank in those days, showing American films, and they would say Raoul Walsh Festival, and I had never heard of Raoul Walsh. And I became interested in the French fascination with American directors. And during that time, there was a festival of Orson Welles films at the Cinémathèque at the Palais de Chaillot. And I went, and in 1 week I saw Citizen Cain, The Magnificent Ambersons, The Lady from Shanghai, and Touch of Evil. And on Friday night, they were showing Othello, and Welles himself came to speak, and you couldn't get near the place. And I had never seen any of these films before. So I was kind of enthralled with movies. Around that time, a friend of mine was editing a small documentary in his apartment on West End Avenue. And I visited him, and I saw for the first time editing equipment, splicers, rewinds, a moviola. And this was in the 60s, so this was pre-videotape.
Right.
And the only way you could see a moving image in those days was in the movie theaters or on television live. There was no tape. There's no replay of anything. The only way you could see a moving image was forward at sound speed. So here was this machine where you could go forward, you could go backward, you could stop on a frame, and I was thunderstruck. I thought, oh my God, what a fantastic tool. And I had always liked working with my hands, and I was drawn to it for that reason. And I left architecture school and got a job in the business.
And you met Mr. De Palma fairly early through your brother, was it?
Yes, my brother Chuck, Charles, was at Universal. He had been a manager of the Garrick Theater in Greenwich Village next door to the Bleecker Street Theater. And he'd been recruited into a sort of junior executive program at Universal Pictures on Park Avenue, 45th Street. And they were, I guess they were further up, they were in the 50s. But anyway, Universal was constantly being approached by New York filmmakers looking for financing for their projects. And my brother was put in charge of scouting young directing and writing talents. And in fact, I think he was just there as a lightning rod to deflect people away from the other executives. They never, I don't think they really intended to do anything with walk-ins off the street. But some of those walk-ins were, people who became important directors later on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
and
Brian was one of those walk-ins, and my brother Chuck tried to get Universal to finance a film directed by Brian, and they would have none of it. So during a 2-week vacation from Universal, he raised money independently and produced and co-wrote with Brian a picture called Greetings, which starred Bob De Niro among a couple of others. It was a story of 3 young men trying to evade the draft, or avoid the draft, let's say. And it was in 1968. It was the height of the Vietnam War and the height of the anti-Vietnam movement, and an earth-shattering year in American history.
Yes.
And so they made this film, and I had gotten a job at that point. I had worked my way up in various small jobs, and had gotten a job as an assistant editor at a trailer house. And I was starting to cut trailers, and when Greetings was finished, Chuck came to me and had me cut the trailer for it, which I did. And Brian and I met, and we kind of hit it off. And when Greetings turned out to be sort of a minor hit, they got money from the financing company, a company called Sigma 3. They were the distributors, Sigma 3, to do a sort of a sequel, which was originally entitled Son of Greetings. And then we changed the title to Hi, Mom.
Yeah.
And it was the further adventures of the character De Niro had played in Greetings. And that was the first film I edited. I was 23 years old and didn't know anything, but didn't know I didn't know anything.
Yeah, that's a wonderful time. I had just a general question, because you entered the industry at a time when movies were changing, and that you were speaking about visiting France and awakening to movies there. The European influence was really showing up in 70s cinema, and I'm curious, how did that reflect in the editing style of the time?
Well, I think editing is a nonverbal language, and as such, it crosses international borders easily. So you can see influences from American films traveling east across into Europe and other things that they do coming west. I think editors watch films. We get ideas from other people's films. We get ideas from our own work. It's sort of a process of accretion where things are picked up and utilized and become standard, and then people make, we stand on the shoulders of all the editors who've gone before. I remember seeing Breathless, and I didn't know anything about editing, but I was excited by the film in ways that I didn't fully understand. And I had the pleasure of meeting Cécile Décugis several years ago in France. She was the woman who edited Breathless, and it was quite interesting talking with her.
The first entry that De Palma had in the thriller genre really is Sisters. And I'm curious to know a couple of things about that film. And one is the use of split screen, which De Palma does quite a bit. And if I'm not mistaken, you're not so crazy about split screen, are you?
No, not really. I mean, I find that, it's an intellectual device rather than an emotional device. And I think it takes the audience out of the movie for a moment, while it's on. It's fascinating, but it distances you from the characters in the film.
Yeah. It was obviously shot and conceived to utilize split screen, correct?
Of course. Yeah, he had simultaneous cameras in the scene where the victim, I forget his name, Philip is the character's name. Philip crawls to the window, and scrawls on the window in blood, and Jennifer Salt is across the way and sees him. That moment was shot simultaneously from inside the room where he's writing on the window and from Jennifer's point of view.
Right.
So, and then when the police arrive and Dr. Breton is trying to make his escape, there was shots in the hallway shot simultaneously where they come out of the elevator, he ducks around the corner, and then they go by, and he crosses from one screen to the other. It's very successful, I thought.
Mm-hmm. And when the film gets progressively kind of loonier as it goes on, it's terrific. Did you work to make your editing reflect that? Was there a different pace that happened in the editing as the film went on?
No, you just respond to. See, I was still, look, I was 26 when I did Sisters, my second film. Mm-hmm. Very different from Hi Mom, which was sort of one sketch after another, basically. Loose, kind of a loose story. I mean, the script for Hi Mom was, 3 or 4 pages on a legal tablet. That was Brian's outline, but the whole thing was sort of semi-improvised.
Right.
Whereas Sisters was scripted and in many instances covered in a way that films are conventionally covered, with wider shots, tighter shots, and so forth. And, I was still feeling my way and learning. I had no one to teach me editing. I sort of had to discover it on my own, which was an experience actually I shared with Walter Murch, who said he had the same experience, that he had never been taught either, and discovered the rules by working and making mistakes and correcting it and seeing what works as opposed to what doesn't work. And in effect, the experience of doing that was sort of like gave me the feeling that I was inventing editing, even though it had already, I was reinventing something hundreds of other people had, thousands, if not thousands, had already discovered. But having to do it myself and reinventing it myself was very exciting.
Well, you're finding your own voice in that art form.
Finding my own way, yeah.
Yeah. Is it difficult because you're so close to it and you live with the footage for so long? Is it difficult to maintain a fresh perspective to truly know if it's working?
Yeah, I mean, the process is such that once you get something working, you stop paying attention to it and you focus on what's not working. Mm-hmm. So that your focus is never. Your focus is constantly changing because the things that work start to outnumber the things that don't work, and then eventually everything's working as well as you can make it. And then you focus your attention on sound effects or music or color or other aspects of the finishing process as opposed to just strictly looking at it from an editorial standpoint.
Right. You after Sisters, you did Phantom of the Paradise and
yes.
Obsession
yes.
For De Palma. Was Obsession really a breakaway from the style of those earlier De Palma films, the way you cut it?
Well, it was shot in widescreen. Vilmos Zsigmond was the cinematographer, and Vilmos is a genius. I mean, the stuff is extraordinarily beautiful. And it was my first experience cutting a widescreen movie. And, when CinemaScope first came in the 50s in Hollywood, they would shoot everything in masters and hold everything for a very long time because they thought, well, it's a big screen, there's a lot more to look at. So the style of the photography changed to more masters and group shots as opposed to close-ups, and the editing style reflected that as well. Mm-hmm. So when I started cutting Obsession, Brian had not particularly made any of those, sort of 50s-like choices. He shot it as you would other films, and I cut it. My sense of the pacing of the film is always derived from the tempo that's established by the action. So I wasn't thinking in terms of the tableau and, gee, I ought to hold this longer because it's a big screen.
Mm-hmm.
So I just cut it according to my own, my own feeling about pace based on the action and the pace of the dialogue and so forth, and whether I want to be on somebody delivering a line or if the reaction to that line is more significant than the person delivering the line and so forth, the choices you always make. And when I first saw it projected, I thought I had this moment of terrible anxiety that everything looked too short, because I was seeing it on the big screen, and I thought, oh my God, this all could play longer. You could look at this stuff longer. And then I decided no, it was fine. I got over the anxiety and I looked at it again and more rationally, and I thought, no, this works fine. About that time, Jaws came out, and Brian was friends with Steven Spielberg, and he often came to the editing room. And I said to him, it was interesting watching Jaws because it was shot in the widescreen, but it was cut no differently than you would cut a 4:3 movie for television in terms of the pace. But it didn't slow down to accommodate the big screen. And Steven agreed. He said, yeah, you just cut it like any movie.
When you become involved in these projects, with the De Palma films, do you come in at the pre-production stage? I mean, do you have the script and invest in the script before they start shooting, or at what time do you come in usually?
Well, back in those days, we were all very young, and yeah, I would get copies of the script beforehand. But no, I was not involved in pre-production in terms of casting or any of those other physical considerations. But I'd get a copy of the script and I'd give Brian my comments.
What with Blowout, particularly with the editing, I would think that would be a particularly challenging project because so much of it articulates the process of filmmaking as well, and the syncing of the footage with the sound,
right.
And you see all of that working.
Right. Well, that was fun. I mean, it's interesting that now that that's all obsolete, it's become a sort of a document, a sort of a historical record of filmmaking techniques of the previous, century.
Yeah.
We didn't realize that at the time that it would be, like that. But it was very much influenced by, those scenes were very much influenced by Blow-Up, Antonioni's
Mm-hmm.
Blow-Up, where he was in the dark room and, making successful greater enlargements and so forth. And even the title, when Brian, I think the original title of the film was Personal Effects, or maybe that was my idea for the title. But anyway, when he said we're going to name it Blowout, I kind of groaned because it was so obviously derivative of Blow Up,
Mm-hmm.
And Brian has always been, vulnerable to the charge of plagiarism.
What is your take on that? Because, I've asked the previous guests about this that we've had for the series. The Hitchcock comparison always comes up.
Right. Well, in point of fact, I think actually Brian and Hitchcock are very similar in terms of their personalities. They're both drawn to the dark side. They have they share kind of sardonic wit,
mm-hmm.
and they're very visual. And I think those things are not. They're similar to Hitchcock, but they are, in fact, genuine with Brian. Those are genuine aspects of his personality. So, of course, he's going to be influenced. And interested in film, he's going to be influenced and drawn to somebody who's so similar to him as a person.
Right.
And I might add, slightly sadistic as well.
Yes.
So all those things, the wit, the dark humor, the visual flair, and the kind of sadistic quality, and a fascination with women in peril.
Mm-hmm.
I think all those are shared by both men, and just Hitchcock came first.
Well, with Carrie, when you're talking about women in peril, such a strong female characters in that film, and the film works because you so empathize with Carrie White.
Right.
So when it all goes to hell at the end, it truly is horrifying.
Right.
And any discussion of De Palma, it always focuses upon the sequences.
Right.
And of course, the big one in Carrie is the prom sequence.
Right.
What can you share with me about building that sequence and making it work?
Well, the prom sequence breaks into two halves. There was a long build-up to, the key moment is when they dump the bucket of blood on Carrie. So preceding that moment, there's a long, extended section where all the elements are put in place. There's a long tracking shot, which starts with one of the students collecting ballots, and then she goes around to all the tables collecting ballots for King and Queen of the Prom, and then she goes over to the door, she kisses her boyfriend, they swap the ballots. Well, you see this is all in one shot. And she takes the fake ballots, which have, been rigged so that Carrie wins the election, and she takes them over to the teacher's desk, and then the camera comes down and we see Nancy Allen and John Travolta hiding under the bandstand. And then there's a rope in Nancy's hand. We follow the rope, and it goes around the stage, and we see, I think we see Amy Irving on the side there, and then the camera cranes up, and we follow the rope, and then the camera winds up directly over the bucket. And you can see the blood in the bucket, and you can see the microphone where they're making the announcements from directly below the bucket. And then the camera tilts up and zooms back in to the table where the shot originated. So that's one single shot that establishes the geography and the layout of all the characters. And then there's a long slow-motion sequence when Carrie's announced as the winner, where she walks up to the stage. And that, I think in that slow-motion sequence there were about 100 setups.
Wow.
So, yeah. And then once she gets the blood dumped, then the slow motion ends and chaos begins. And that's at that point, Brian introduced the split screen.
Right.
Well, when the studio saw it, they did not like the split screen. And he got a lot of resistance on that. And he sort of said to me, look, give them what they want. He was disgusted and disappointed, and he said, just, fix it. So many of the shots that he had shot in that sequence, he did not protect half the frame. I mean, he had intended it to be split screen, so half the frame would be, something interesting, and the other half would be light stands and filming equipment that, he hadn't bothered to keep out of the frame because he never intended to use it. Some of the shots were protected for the full frame, and I was able to use, so I used as many of those as I could. When there was no way around it, I had to go with the split screen.
So his choice would have been to use the split screen, that entire section of that sequence.
Yes.
I know that you feel that it's more of an intellectual than an emotional technique, the split screen. But why do you think he's drawn to it? Is it kind of economy that you see her point of view, and then you see the havoc that she's causing on the other half of the frame? Is it?
I think he's just fascinated. I think Brian is just fascinated with being able to see two points of view at the same moment. It's like you can see it from this direction, you can see it from this direction. The nuances of psychology are not his strength. His strengths are visuals and camera movement and choreography and things of that nature, in which the actors are the object of the camera, movements and setups, and these set pieces that he designs are giant mechanisms that are not derived from human psychology, but very often the human behavior is made to fit the design that he's come up with.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, in a picture that I didn't edit, the Vietnam picture with Michael J. Fox, Casualties of War.
Yeah.
There's a sequence where they're putting a bomb underneath a latrine or something. And I remember watching the film, and Michael is trying to strike a Zippo lighter.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the timing requirements, he has to do it much longer than I thought any real human being would have given up. He strikes it. He would have, thrown it away and looked for something else to light his cigarette with. But that's a small thing. But very often, the character's emotions are seen in or depicted in simplistic terms.
Right.
The exception is when you have a great actor, and he has had many great actors in his films. Carrie, for instance, I think, Sissy Spacek evokes sympathy automatically. I mean, she's just an extraordinarily sympathetic character.
Yeah.
But many of the actors whom Brian has discovered, like Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio, and he was an early proponent of John Lithgow, and I think Charles Durning was, first film was Hi Mom, I believe, and many other wonderful actors who have been in his films have really done their best work in other people's films.
Mm. The music, because
yes.
when we discuss those sequences, like Carrie, I mean, you think of Pino's music.
Right.
At what point does that come in, and do you edit to tailor the score at all? How does that work, that process?
When you're editing the film, when I'm editing a film, I often use music to give an indication of how I think the film will play when it's finished. So you resort to existing film scores or classical music or whatever to fill out a temp score or a scratch track, however you want to call it. And then the composer will screen the film with this temp score accompanying the images, and it gives them an idea of what the director and the editor are thinking about in terms of what the finished score has to accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
So then they use that as a guide, and they write their own music, turn the emotions expressed in the temp score, they turn that around and express the same emotions but in their own language, in their own idiom, with their own notes, hopefully.
Right.
But for instance, the scene at the end where Carrie, the famous moment where the hand comes shooting up out of the ground,
right.
The temp score for that was a Albinoni Adagio for organ and strings, which is the saddest music I could find for Amy Irving laying the flowers on Carrie's grave. And then I found a deliberately arrhythmic moment. I lined the music so there was an arrhythmic moment when the hand shoots up out of the ground. And for that, I used the main title from Sisters, which starts with an anvil strike.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sharp metallic sound just at the moment when the first rock is dislodged. It starts to move and the hand comes shooting out. So you have this soft, sweet, sad organ and strings interrupted at a very unexpected moment by loud anvil strike, which is guaranteed to startle anyone.
Yeah. It is a startling sequence. That sequence was...
So Pino just copied that.
Yeah. That sequence is shot... Is it performed? Is it shot backwards? Or what was... It was,
one of those shots was shot in... or a couple of those shots were shot in reverse to give it a dreamlike quality.
Mm-hmm. How does De Palma shoot? Is he very specific about following storyboards when you get the footage? Is there a lot of options, or is it pretty straightforward how he wants it placed together?
It depends. Certain, like the shot I described from the Prom, it's very obvious that's meant to be what it is. Certain shots are designed such that they could only be used for one purpose. Other choices are not immediately apparent. I was working on The Fury once, and I was in New York, and he was in California, and I got this shot in dailies. I didn't quite get how I was supposed to use it. It was a close-up of Amy Irving's hands scratching the arms of the chair she's sitting on. Mm-hmm. And I called him up and I said, Brian, I'm a little unclear about this shot. And he said to me, "You're the editor, you figure it out." And he hung up on me. So I figured it out, I used it as I saw it, and he liked what I did. So sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. But Brian was always very supportive of my work. He was my champion early on, and it was through his working on his films that I became, known to George Lucas, who offered me the work on Star Wars.
Yeah.
And Brian was very supportive and instrumental in my getting that job, and I can't thank Brian enough for everything he did for me and the stuff that we did together. We had a great time working our way up.
Yeah. Before I let you go, I just want to ask you any recollections or thoughts on the process of putting together Raising Cain.
Right. Well, Raising Cain Raising Cain was a puzzle for me because at that time I was working at 20th Century Fox. I was sort of the in-house film doctor at the studio, and I'd been doing it for about a year, and I was not happy with the job because basically the job is turning terrible pictures into bad pictures. I mean, and that really wasn't fun for me. I wanted to be working on good films. I mean, that's my whole ambition in life, was to work on good projects. And even though there were certain perks of being, inside the studio, and I got to see, Daryl Zanuck's personal steam room and all that, but in fact, the work was not fun. And at that point, I was working on a picture where the director really didn't want me, and my services were not welcome, and I was eager to get out of there. And I got a call from Brian's agent, and he said, "Brian needs help." And I said, "Okay, I'm there." So I told Fox I was leaving, and I flew up to San Francisco where they were cutting the picture, and I read the script on the plane. I hadn't read the script yet. And I read the script, and I thought, what? Huh? What? So I got there, and I looked at the film, and I said, "Brian, I don't get it." He said, "Look, it's very simple, and he starts explaining it to me, and I was still puzzled, because I thought, what? Because, in the film, woman dreams about dreaming and then wakes up and dreams that she wakes up in the dream, but she hasn't woken up. It's part of the dream. So, I said, is this, I don't get it. Is this a dream? Or, and then he had titles, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And I thought, what? I don't know. It was just, I guess I'm a very literal person. So anyway, part of what we did was to straighten out the chronology a bit.
Right.
Because it was just, when I first saw it, it was moving forward and backward. It was just totally mystifying. I just couldn't figure out what was going on. So, but he said, "Boy, if my own editor can't understand that, I must be in trouble." But it was fun. The film has that sardonic De Palma humor in it.
Yeah. And
we were editing in a I guess it was a guest house in Woodside, California. It was winter. We had a log fire in the editing room, and I was still working on film in those days. And to keep himself amused, Brian would bring books to read, magazines and books to read while he sat behind me. And I remember at that point he was reading a book that was an instruction guide to how to commit suicide. I forget what it was called. And he would read aloud from it to me while we were working. And I remember he was saying, here's a good one. You take a lot of sleeping pills and put a plastic bag over your head. This is how he would entertain us while we were working. It was I love working with Brian. It's very enjoyable. We go back so far. It's
Yeah. I recall I did seeing Raising Cain when it was released theatrically, and like the zinger at the end of Carrie, the one that comes in the last shot of Raising Cain. I have rarely heard a reaction like that from a crowded theater. It just screams. It was
great. When Lizzo appeared.
Yes, and it left you on such a high, when you left the theater. It's terrific. I do love that picture.
I've heard that, not a lot of people, a lot of people had problems with the idea of stealing the children, kidnapping children. But we used to say, and there's a catchphrase that developed around the editing room, which, have you spoken to the others? That line that Lizzo delivers. Oh, no, it was Bill Finley.
Yeah.
Bill Finley, have you spoken to the others?
Do you attend? Do they have screenings, or is the screening process important for you to gauge how a film's working?
Yeah, it's easier with a horror picture or a comedy because you get vocal reactions that you can evaluate. I remember when we were screening Carrie, we had screenings at the MGM screening room in New York, and all the seats in the theater are sprung. That you can lean back in them, and Brian and I would sit in the last row when that hand came shooting up out of the ground. Every seat in the theater recoiled as everybody stiffened, and we'd laugh. It was so funny to see every seat in the theater go back at the same moment. But in comedies you can gauge where the laughs are. That's very important.
Right.
But in a drama, like a picture like Ray, which I edited, when the picture's working, you can't hear anything. The best response is no response. In a drama, everybody, sits there like quiet as a pin, So, I think screenings are most useful for, like I say, films where you can hear or experience the response by the audience.
Yeah, an audible reaction.
The kind of testing that they do out here of asking questions about this and that, I don't know that it's terribly useful.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about movies now. What do you think the state of film editing and movies in general, where that lies now?
Well, the state of editing is, the digital tools that we have now are extraordinary because it gives you so much freedom. You can do so many extraordinary things and have so much control over what you're doing compared to working on film. For instance, when I was working on Ray, I would do these multi-layered montages of, various layers, one on top of the other, and I could do it right in the Avid. And I could control exactly what frame. If I was going to do an iris, I could control where on the screen the iris would close down and how fast, and, control that. And, on film, you'd have to send it out to an optical house and wait a week and get it back and tell them what they did wrong,
Right.
So, working on the Avid is extraordinary. The problem is I once wrote a little article for one of the editing magazines out here called How the Avid Made the Work Easier and the Job Harder. Because the Avid, because of its speed, makes the editing process interesting to people with ADD, who are executives and so forth, people like that, or to be more charitable about it, people who are have very busy schedules and don't have a lot of time to focus on the editing process. When it was on film, they wouldn't stick around because everything took so long. Yeah. With the Avid, everything is so immediate that, and the big screen we now cut on 42-inch plasma screens, and instead of a 5-inch or a Steenbeck is a 18-inch screen or whatever it is. Now there's a big screen. Everybody can sit back on the couch and talk about this or that. It invites people into the process,
right?
Which is, I think, deleterious. But for the practitioner, it's great. But in terms of the sociology of it, it's not great.
Right. Well,
and the films, today are just really depressing. I mean, the films that Hollywood is making is just, it's demoralizing because they're not making the kind of films they made even 10 years ago. They tend to make, bland comedies or
copycats of everything you've seen.
Comic book adaptations of comic books, comedies, and big action, franchise films.
Mm-hmm.
But they make the films for the audience that they can most easily manipulate.
Yeah.
Through advertising. So it's kind of depressing.
But
people like me who like good stories, I find
exactly.
I find the foreign films to be more interesting today than most American films.
Yeah.
There are always exceptions. I thought The Kids Were All Right was very good.
Well, the Source Code is the movie that the last movie that you've been working on.
Yes.
The new Duncan Jones film.
Yes.
And he's a really exciting filmmaker.
Yes.
as evidenced by Moon.
Yes.
What are your feelings about this project?
I have high hopes for it. I think it's a really fascinating. I think excellent cast, a great story, and we'll see how it plays.
Well, I look forward to seeing that, and I just want to. You've had such an incredible contribution to films, and so many of them are very close to my heart. So I just want to thank you for bringing those to me. Thank you so much.
You never even mentioned John Hughes.
I didn't. I was going to ask about it, but you've been so great with me, giving me this much time. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is my favorite Hughes film, and one of my favorite comedies, and I really do want to know
about Ferris.
I do like Ferris, but I find that I return to Planes, Trains most often.
Interesting. That's a whole saga in itself.
Planes, Trains? Oh,
yeah.
I did have a question about Planes, Trains because I was contacted from someone that they wanted to see. Apparently, there's an hour of extra footage that wasn't placed in the final cut that hasn't been made available. It's in a vault somewhere, and so I said that I would ask you about that.
Oh, I'd love to see that. We the first cut of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles was 3 hours and 40 minutes.
Wow.
And we screened 12 reels, stopped, had sandwiches, and then we screened another 12 reels. And at the end of it, John turned to me, he said, "It's too long." I said, "I know." So we went through it on the first pass, and we took out an hour and 10 minutes, just like that. We just threw it out. It was like almost a third of the film. We just out. And we worked another 3 or 4 weeks, or 5 or 6 weeks, and got it down to 2 hours. And we previewed the 2-hour version, which we thought was hysterical. And the audience did not agree.
Huh.
And I would love to see a copy of that cut if it existed anywhere. But, we didn't have tape in those days. We didn't have... I guess they had tape, but it was not... We didn't have tape in the editing room. It was all film, so you'd have to send it out to get a videotape. And it was just... he made, John, I have to ask his sons if they ever... One of them contacted me after he died and said he was going to call me when he got to L.A., but he hasn't called. But I mean, to ask him if there's a copy of that cut in his possession. But I thought that was a terrific cut. But then eventually, we previewed the picture 9 times. Of course, with a comedy, you can tell where the laughs are and where they're not.
Yeah.
And we kept cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting, and the running time now is 90 minutes, I think.
So it was just a question of getting it as tight as possible to make it work, or?
Well, that was part of it, and the other half was that it's a character comedy, and interestingly enough, the smallest thing can make a huge difference in a character film, whether it's a character character drama, or character comedy. The smallest thing can turn an audience around about a particular character, and it turns out that in our original cut, Candy was perceived as a user. He was taking advantage of Steve. And so they didn't like him, and then they lost patience with Steve for they thought, why is he staying with this guy who's just using him? And it took us 4 screenings to figure that out, and then we put back a line that we had taken out, something where he offered to pay for something once. Oh, let me pay for that. No, that's okay. And that was it. Then they liked him.
Huh.
It was the smallest thing, but it turned everything around. It was quite amazing.
There's a cut in that film that I love, and it's Steve Martin. I think after Candy steals the taxi cab, he sees him again. He's trying to place where he remembers him.
Yeah.
And there's a quick cut to John Candy looking through the taxi cab door window.
Yeah.
And yet the door is somehow separated from the taxi cab.
In the airport.
Yes.
In the airport lounge. Yeah.
Right. I do love that movie.
There was a shot of Candy in that airport lounge where Steve, they race to get to the airport, and then the plane is delayed, so they're just sitting there. So they're waiting, and I forget what's in the film anymore, because I've been through so many versions. But at one point, he takes off his shoes, and then Steve reacts to the smell of his feet or something, and he's watching Candy, sort of trying not to look at him, but he can't help it, At one point, Candy is eating a chili dog and smoking a cigarette at the same time. And he takes an enormous bite of the chili dog. First he takes a drag on the cigarette, takes a deep drag on the cigarette, and then he takes a bite of the chili dog and blows smoke out his nostrils while he's chewing the chili dog. Which is fabulous, but
that is great.
I don't know if that made its way into the final cut. But
what kind of guy was John Hughes? Because he was. So little is known about him. We did a show on him and interviewed 5 or 6 people that had worked with him. But in your experience, what kind of collaborator was he?
Well, he's the funniest man I've ever met in my life. There were days I couldn't work because I was laughing so hard. He would get on a roll. He would start telling a story, and then an hour would go by, and he would just embellish and embroider, and I would just be in tears, And at the same time, he was sort of mercurial and moody, and so he was extraordinary. His writing is extraordinary.
Yeah,
and it's a loss. But he never liked Hollywood. He hated Hollywood, and he hated the interference by studios and getting creative notes. He couldn't stand that.
Right.
So finally, he had enough money. He just said, "Screw it," and he went home.
Did you have any interaction with him when he left the business in those years?
No. I saw him once in the early '90s when I was doing that job with Fox, where I cut a picture called Dutch, which he produced.
Right.
I saw him then, but that was the last of it.